Good morning and welcome everybody to this autumn meeting of the SIS. I'm Deputy Chairman, so I'm detailed to introduce, which is totally unnecessary. Bob Johnson will tell us all about these subjects, some of which you've heard before, but you've got some new insights.
A new perspective.
A new perspective. There you go. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me once again to speak here. And the subject I've chosen to speak on today, as you can see, is why the electric universe is not the same as the plasma universe, and perhaps more importantly, why it matters. Just so we're clear about the terminology, when I use the term electric universe, I mean both the movement and their particular model of how the universe is supposed to work. The other terms will become clear as we go along. And I hope to show you that even though the EU agrees with the PU in recognising the need for incorporating plasma physics into astrophysics, the EU and the PU have very different fundamental principles, objectives, and modus operandi. In particular, the EU promotes one model to the exclusion of all others. But this may not be the right one. The future of the plasma universe, or rather the future of plasma cosmology, may lie in a completely different direction. There are two questions. The boundaries between the electric universe and the plasma universe often seem to have been blurred, where it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. And critics of the EU certainly seem to think the EU and the PU are the same thing. They then dismiss both in the same breath. But is the EU the same as the PU? And why does it matter? Well, the first question can be answered very easily. Tony Peratt, author of The Physics of the Plasma Universe, wrote in the introduction to the first edition, "The purpose of this book is to address the growing recognition of the need for plasma physics in astrophysics." He went on to suggest that the PU is the unified discipline of the study of cosmic plasma and astrophysics together. In contrast, the EU have recently stated on YouTube that the results of their Sapphire experiment show a desperate need for a new perspective in planetary science, one which recognises charge exchange between celestial bodies. And similarly, Thornhill has written that Velikovsky's basic premise of planetary encounters has been confirmed and the details fleshed out to an extraordinary degree, and that there is a crucial distinction between the planetary catastrophism of the electric universe and that of neo-catastrophists who attempt to explain the evidence for planetary encounters in terms of cometary phenomena. Now, obviously that model of charge exchange between celestial bodies and Velikovsky's near collisions of the planets within the last few thousand years is particular to the EU. It's not found in Peratt's PPU or anywhere else in plasma physics or astrophysics. There's another major difference as well. The Thunderbolts Project trademark, which is a voice for the EU, seems to have been set up to sell their main product, the EU model. You're looking at an extract from Thornhill's Hollow Science website. As you can see, he never misses an opportunity to remind readers that the electric universe is also a registered trademark. The EU is a very commercial organisation, and you can even buy the t-shirt. In contrast, Peratt's PPU is a plasma physics textbook. So, the EU certainly isn't the same as the PU. They're as different as chalk and cheese. We could perhaps stop there, but the second question of why it matters is going to take a little longer to answer, and involve looking in more detail at the reasons why the EU isn't the same as the PU. If they're not the same, then what relationship do they have? Thornhill has stated on his Hollow Science website that the EU is more interdisciplinary and inclusive of information than any prior cosmology. Or in other words, there's more to the EU than you get with the PU. There's no obvious indication in the EU publicity that they're being selective about which parts of the PU they include, so let's assume to start off with that the EU includes the whole of the PU. Adopting their commercial approach, this would be like a special offer along the lines of buy the EU theory and get the PU free. But let's check what's in the box before parting with any money. The EU's hypothesis of charge exchange between celestial bodies and Velikovsky's near collisions of those charged planets with Earth in the last few thousand years effectively defines the EU box. And we can put a number of other hypotheses in the EU box as well, including the Saturn theory and Jurgen's anode sun model, together with its later development, the electric sun. None of these are in the PU part. Inside the PU box, according to the EU's sales pitch, is the whole of plasma cosmology, which was built on Berkeley's foundations by scientists such as Alfvén and Gaia. Now, a background sketch may be useful here. In the early 20th century, Berkeley postulated the existence of charged particles in what was then supposed to be the vacuum of space. Unfortunately, Berkeley died in 1917, leaving the proponents of the space is a vacuum view, led by Sidney Chapman, largely free to dictate the course of astrophysics in the years that followed. But as Perrat later wrote, it was not until 1974 that space probe measurements decided the controversy in Berkeley's favour. That's a long time that the space is a vacuum view held sway. In 1950, Alfvén and his colleague Faltermeyer had published Cosmic Electrodynamics, in which they argued in favour of including electric currents in the understanding of space plasmas. Alfvén continued to promote the role of electric currents in space until his death in 1989. In 1992, as we've seen, Perrat coined the term plasma universe to describe the new discipline, which is also sometimes referred to as plasma cosmology. He later extended the scope of the PU by identifying the relation between petroglyphs and the type of plasma formations he'd seen in his work on high-energy plasma discharges in the Los Alamos lab. An inclusion of this aspect of the PU is the main difference between the first 1992 edition and the second 2015 edition of Perrat's book PPU. Meanwhile, on a different track, in 1944 Bruce had hypothesized about an all-electric universe, based on his hypothesis that the Sun's photosphere consisted of electric arc discharges. And also, as I'm sure you know, Velikovsky had published Cosmos Without Gravitation in 1946 and Worlds in Collision in 1950. Both men continued to develop their hypotheses until their deaths, which were coincidentally both in 1979. As we've seen, the modern EU movement derives largely from Velikovsky, but it draws also on Bruce's work. So we can already see the different strands of the PU and the EU thinking emerging. Inside the PU box are Birkeland currents, plasma filaments in space, double layers, parallel electric fields, and many other aspects of plasma behaviour that anyone who follows the EU will be familiar with. Also in the box is recognition of the value of Birkeland's Tirela experiments in helping to demonstrate that phenomena such as the auroras can be explained by considering charged particles in space. It also includes Perrat's more recent hypothesis that petroglyphs could have been records of plasma events seen in the heavens within the last 12,000 years or so. So, are the EU simply continuing that tradition of extending the range of the PU after inheriting Alfvén's mantle, as has sometimes been suggested? It would be nice to think so, but we've already had a hint that this is somewhat misleading. What you get in the EU box is very different to the contents of the PU box, and would not be seen as a valid extension of PU theory by the pioneers, as Parat himself has made clear in the introduction to his 2015 edition of PPU. So, in a nutshell, PU is based on sound plasma physics backed up with lab research and a detailed mathematical modelling. And this includes both fluid analysis and kinetic particle-in-cell models, requiring massive amounts of computer time on the largest machines available. The EU, on the other hand, is largely based on speculative proposals and visual analogies. And these are backed up by claims that genuine examples of plasma behaviour in space are evidence for their own model based on close encounters between charged planets. This sales technique of mixing PU fact and EU theory is easy to miss if you're not looking carefully. And we can see the sales technique in action when we look closely at their YouTube video series, Top 10 Reasons Why the Universe is Electric. Episode 2 is a particularly good example. It's titled Filaments in Space, and it does present a lot of genuine evidence for filamentary behaviour of plasma in space, including lightning discharges, sprites in the Earth's upper atmosphere, electric currents between Jupiter and Saturn and their respective moons, and the filamentary nature of penumbral filaments on the Sun. But these genuine examples of plasma behaviour are intermixed with key claims of the EU's model, such as, in the EU, all stars are positively charged anodes, the erroneous claim that magnetic ropes have been stretching from the Sun to Saturn, and many more. Now, it's claimed that these pieces of genuine evidence all attest to the electric circuitry in the solar system. Dave Tolbert has stated the implications of this finding elsewhere. I do not believe that anyone, following the fact-based discussions in recent years, including 5 full-length documentaries, more than 100 episodes of Space News, and 31 episodes of our discourses on an alien sky, would want to suggest that evidence for an electrified heliosphere is lacking. Yes, an electrified heliosphere does mean an electric sun. Well, it sounds pretty convincing, doesn't it? But what's not mentioned is that the existence of the heliospheric current sheet extending throughout the heliosphere has been recognised by astrophysicists for decades, but they would not agree that this means an electric sun. Alfvén's diagram of the complete circuit of the HCS, which you can see on this slide, shows the current passing above the photosphere between the equatorial planes and up to both poles. It then passes along the rotational axis and returns back to the equatorial plane at some unspecified distance from the Sun. But despite drawing this circuit diagram, Alfvén didn't take the fact that the heliosphere was electrified to mean that the Sun itself is electric. On the contrary, Jurgens, who invented the model of an electrically powered Sun, complained bitterly that Alfvén wouldn't endorse it. What Jurgens wrote about Alfvén is seldom mentioned by the EU, so here it is for the record. Hannes Alfvén has been a pioneer in seeking understanding of the cosmic roles of electricity and magnetism. Yet, by accepting the prevailing notions that the universe is inherently neutral and that the stars are powered internally, Alfvén has effectively sealed himself off from discovering many important electrical phenomena. Thus he has uncovered little fundamental information about the universe from his electrical studies. Well, Jurgens was obviously disappointed that Alfvén didn't support his theory, but Alfvén was the better scientist. He won the Nobel Prize. In contrast, we'll say later how Jurgens misinterpreted the evidence he used for his own anode-sun model. Now back to T10R episode 2. This shows Don Scott's diagram indicating how the EU theorists modified Alfvén's HCS electric circuit by routing the current through the photosphere so that it enters and leaves the body of the Sun. But I've shown previously that Alfvén's HCS circuit is correct. Jurgens' model, with the current entering and leaving the photosphere, is contradicted by the actual evidence. Now, the EU have abandoned Jurgens' 10 billion volt model in favour of what I call a hybrid model, in which the Sun is partially driven by an unquantified amount of incoming current, which in turn is supposed to drive fusion in the photosphere. This hybrid electric model retains Jurgens' key concept of an anode sun, with currents entering and leaving it. And the granulation of the photosphere is supposed to be evidence of the behaviour of an anode in this electrical circuit. However, I showed here last year that this hybrid concept is also flawed. The electric discharge activity seen in the solar spectra is coming from coronal loops and chromospheric flares, not from the photosphere. It's only in EU theory that one finds an electric sun. It's not in the PU box of proper plasma physics. So we need to update our diagram to include the EU claim about an electrified heliosphere, but also to note that Alfvén's HCS circuit has been omitted from the PU box and that it doesn't imply an electric sun. Now, episode 2 continues. The commentary states that filaments are acknowledged nearly everywhere, and this is simply taken as direct confirmation of Thornhill and Talbot's claim in their book, The Electric Universe, that stars are formed in a Z-pitch between twin Bertrand currents. This episode concludes with a discussion of the magnetic fields which have been identified everywhere we look in space. But we don't know how these vast fields are generated. Apparently, astronomers must recognise the electric currents required to produce and sustain magnetic fields. Notice how the PU fact is followed by the EU theory. This is then followed by reference to Peratt's simulations of two Bertrand currents interacting to form a spiral galaxy-like pattern. And it ends with a statement that Alfvén wrote that space is filled with currents. And that lends Alfvén's authority to what you've just been told. But when you look carefully, you can see that T10R episode 2 is a classic example of smoke and mirrors technique. Genuine evidence for electrical currents in space, and valid statements such as, for several years astrophysicists have recognised the electrical currents connecting Saturn and Jupiter to their moons, are being used to persuade the audience to believe the EU's big picture illusion, that electric currents are the primary factor, magnetic fields are secondary, and therefore the EU model must be right. Michael Armstrong, the man behind Mikamar Publishing, who has published many of the EU's books, wrote elsewhere about a critical article on the EU in Vice.com, calling it a masterful mix of some factual information, canted innuendo, misinformation and misrepresentation. But it seems to me that's a case of the pot calling the kettle black when we look at this episode 2 of T10R. What the EU don't explain in episode 2 is where the currents are supposed to come from. But we know from episode 3 that in the EU, space has a vast substructure of electrical potential, typically extremely subtle at any point, but sufficient to affect cosmic directionality. Both stars and galaxies occur like pearls on a string, revealing a filamentary or even cellular structure of the universe. In other words, the EU simply assume that the source of currents in space are regions of different electrical potential, which are discharging via Bertrand currents. On a smaller scale, the Sun is stated to be an anode, which is delivering power to the planets, which are charged to a different potential. But how these regions of different potential arise in the first place is never explained. Episode 4 is titled Light Bulbs in Space, and it develops the EU's analogy between electrically powered stars and household light bulbs, both being powered from a remote generating station. Unfortunately, this episode starts off with a fundamental error. It's acknowledged that electric currents in space are recognised by the mainstream, but then it's claimed that the mainstream assumes that they're produced by mechanical and kinetic processes, obviously trying to equate the term kinetic with simple Newtonian mechanics. The more mechanical and kinetic denigration occurs later. But what's very concerning is that the EU are showing that they don't understand the term kinetic, despite continually trumpeting Tony Peratt's computer modelling of plasma. These particle-in-cell computations are based on kinetic modelling. In fact, the whole EU argument requires the kinetic approach to modelling plasma behaviour, because this approach can replicate features such as currents and double layers, which the alternative fluid approach can't do. But if the EU don't even understand the terminology, how can we trust their interpretation of the plasma physics? There's more unsupported speculation in the episode which follows. The draft of episode 5, posted in November last year, looks at pulsars. This episode describes pulsars in terms of Scott's hypothesis of a plasma bridge between two closely orbiting binaries, one of which is being charged by an external current. Scott suggests that this may be the explanation of pulsar behaviour if the system was acting as an oscillating electric circuit discharging along the plasma bridge. Comments were invited privately on this draft of episode 5, but unfortunately for Scott's hypothesis, a keen supporter of the EU pointed out that radio engineers have shown that a plasma bridge between binaries couldn't produce the stable oscillations that have been observed between pulsars. There are many puzzling aspects of pulsar behaviour which do appear to require a plasma-based explanation, but Scott's speculations are clearly as impractical as his diagram of the HCS and electric sun that we saw earlier. Episodes 6 and 7 concentrate on charged planets, once again using valid evidence of electrical activity to support the EU's various contentions that electric charge exchange between the sun and planets is the best explanation for many phenomena unexplained in standard astronomy. And it's the electric current system connecting Earth and Sun which drives our weather. And it has always been the EU's position that the planet's powerful auroras, polar storms and magnetic fields, etc., are induced by powerful Bertrand currents from the Sun, focused at the planet's poles, and various other similar categorical statements of how the solar system works, according to the EU. Episode 8 continues with the theme of charged planets, exploring electrical planetary scarring. It begins, evidence for electric currents throughout space is now undeniable, and is more and more routinely acknowledged by cosmologists and astrophysicists. But ramifications have been slow to effect any meaningful change in consensus scientific theory. A major obstacle is a lingering belief that science discovery has emphatically contradicted that celestial being the source of electrical discharges between them, and astrophysicists are told they need to catch up. As we've seen in previous examples, alternative explanations are never given a hearing. Genuine evidence of currents in space is taken to verify the EU model based on charged celestial bodies being the source of electrical discharges between them, and astrophysicists are told they need to catch up. The underlying philosophy is revealed in the interesting statement we saw before about the results of the Sapphire experiment, which were claimed to show a desperate need for a new perspective in planetary science, one which recognises charge exchange between celestial bodies. But it seems to me that the desperate need is the EU's own, to gain acceptance of their particular interpretation of the undoubted electrical activity in the cosmos. Another feature of the EU's publicity is their frequent misrepresentation and misinterpretation of the original sources. In many instances, they may not be directly to blame for misunderstanding, because they tend to rely heavily on secondary sources, such as popular science websites and similar media for their information. And it often happens that these sources have given a particular slant to the research, which is not apparent in the original papers. But on the few occasions when the EU do refer directly to a peer-reviewed source, they still manage to interpret it in a way which suits their model, but one which isn't necessarily in line with the original paper. This failure to accurately represent the original sources can be traced back to Jurgens himself, where, as I showed in 2013, of the 4 key sources he cited in support of his 10 billion volt anode sun model, 3 actually contradicted his interpretation, and the 4th showed that a mere 400 volt drop near the sun was sufficient to explain the relevant observations. Now, a recent example will serve to demonstrate that the problem of misinterpretation continues. In episode 7 of T10R series, reference is made to a 2016 discovery by Jasinski et al. Of a magnetic flux rope apparently stretching between the Sun and Saturn. The EU state that this flux rope is traversing the vast distance between the two bodies, a point reinforced later when they state that the flux rope extends nearly 900 million miles from the Sun to Saturn. However, the commentary also refers to a UCL news report in which Jasinski is quoted as saying that Saturn's magnetosphere behaves similarly to Earth's magnetosphere. Because the well-known Solarwind magnetosphere coupling mechanism doesn't involve a flux rope stretching from the Sun, this immediately raises the question, what does the original paper by Jasinski et al. Actually say about the Saturnian flux ray? Key points from that paper include the following. Conditions at Saturn's magnetopoles are at times conducive to multiple X-line reconnection and flux rope generation. Also, we have presented the first detection of a flux rope at Saturn's dayside magnetopoles. And figure 2 of their paper confirms the spacecraft Cassini's trajectory from Saturn's magnetotail around the dayside magnetopause and shows exactly where the flux rope was found. And I'd like to show you that picture, but it's copyrighted. Similarly, the UCL news report gives further details. A twisted magnetic field structure, previously never seen before at Saturn, has now been detected for the first time. Also, when the Sun's magnetic field interacts with the Earth's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, a complex process occurs called magnetic reconnection, which can twist the field into a helical shape. Now, it's clear from both the original paper and the full UCL news report that the flux rope is located on the day side of the boundary of Saturn's magnetosphere. There is no support whatsoever for the EU's claim that it stretched 900 million miles from Saturn to the Sun. What the EU appear to have done is to read what they want to read in the UCL news report, which was titled Magnetic Flux Rope Observed for the First Time Between Saturn and the Sun. And they've interpreted the word between as meaning stretching 900 million miles between the Sun and Saturn. But the title of the original paper by Jasinski et al. Is Flux Transfer Event Observation at Saturn's Dayside Magnetoforce by the Cassini spacecraft. So if you read the original paper, or even the full UCL news report, it's clear that the use of the word between in the title of the news report must mean located between, not stretching between, as the EU claim. Now, it seems to me that relying on one particular interpretation of one word in the title of a popular news report is cherry-picking in the extreme. We've spent some time on this one point because, firstly, it's an important piece of claimed evidence for the EU's model of Birkeland currents connecting the Sun and planets, which must now be discarded. And secondly, because it shows just how careful one must be not to simply believe everything the popular science media or the EU say. Time and again, you find that the original research doesn't back up the EU claim. Another example of the EU's misrepresentation is in their constant claims that the standard solar model suffers from various anomalies, and so their alternative of an electric sun must be correct. Firstly, this is a false dichotomy. So even if the claimed anomalies for the standard solar model were substantiated, this does not imply that there is only one alternative. And secondly, as I showed in a recent paper, the claimed anomalies don't stand up to scrutiny. The Sapphire Project was also founded on the same false dichotomy. It's presented as being an experiment to test whether the electric sun is a better model than the purportedly gravity-only standard solar model with its claimed anomalies. The basis of the test is to demonstrate electrically driven plasma effects in the laboratory, which bear some similarity to plasma effects on the sun. Then, relying on the claim that a gravity-only standard solar model can't explain these phenomena, the electric sun's declared the winner. But note that this requires misrepresentation of the SSM and of astrophysicists' understanding of the electromagnetic processes in the sun's atmosphere. The EU have set up a straw man, gravity-only SSM, and claimed that only their model includes known plasma behaviour. So it's no surprise on those terms that the electric sun comes out on top. It's also worth remembering that Sapphire was promoted on the basis that no one, apart from Quinn and colleagues, had repeated Birkeland's Torella experiments using modern equipment. In the first place, that's incorrect. There have been at least 16 other groups who've carried out Torella experiments during the intervening century. Secondly, the background has changed enormously since Birkeland's day. As we've seen, Birkeland was striving to demonstrate that there were charged particles in interplanetary space, which drove the auroras on Earth. But the presence of plasma in space has been an accepted fact since 1974. So there's little point in repeating Birkeland's experiments now, because his key finding is well known. But Sapphire's real purpose was very different. Unlike any of the previous Torella experiments, it was apparently designed to prove one particular model by demonstrating examples of plasma behaviour in space, and then claiming them as evidence supporting the particular EU model. Since the commissioning of the Sapphire Project, the EU have started to claim that they are experimental scientists in the Renaissance mode. At one point, Adrian Gilbert, who's here today, his promotion of the EU-UK 2018 conference headlined the EU as the New Enlightenment. But once again, we have to ask, is this true, or was it just marketing spin? I suggest that designing the experiment to prove a particular theory is very different to the groundbreaking research done by Renaissance scientists. And so Adrian's suggestion that the EU represent a new Renaissance has no more validity than the suggestion that the EU have inherited Alfvén's PU mantle. So far, we've seen that what's in the EU box isn't what you might expect from their sales pitch. It's not a scientific extension of the PU theory. It's a particular model that's been erected on the foundations of PU theory and dressed up in plasma clothes. But if you look underneath the window dressing, it's not what the EU want you to think it is. Another thing you'll find in the EU box is your free association with a group which spends a lot of time denigrating mainstream astrophysicists and cosmologists, not to mention most scientists in general. This endless stream of criticism is apparently intended to distinguish the EU as the only group of people on the planet who have the slightest idea of what's really going on, especially when it comes to the role of electricity in space. You know, it's not surprising that no one in the mainstream uses the term PU when it's closely associated in their minds with people who indulge in this form of abuse. And the EU also incessantly misrepresent the state of the art in mainstream science. As has been observed by others familiar with the EU methods, they generally deny that mainstream scientists have any recognition of electrical activity in comets and the rest of outer space, whereas in reality, electrical processes are widely recognised. On the few occasions when the EU need to acknowledge that astrophysics has referred to electrical activity, then, as we've seen above, there's usually a caveat which suggests a lack of complete understanding of the process. That is, the scientists concerned don't fully appreciate the role electricity is playing or where it comes from. It's only the EU who know what's going on, apparently. On a similar theme, as I pointed out in my presentation to the SAS last year, the EU consistently failed to acknowledge that there's a significant minority of plasma scientists who are arguing in favour of a kinetic or particle approach to analysing space plasmas. Sadly, they, like the EU themselves, are struggling to make their voice heard against the majority view that there can be no electric fields in space because of plasma's high conductivity. The consensus scientists still prefer the fluid analysis championed by Eugene Parker and others, who prefer to analyse plasma behaviour in terms of the magnetic field. Now, this approach is easier because you can solve the equations directly. The alternative kinetic approach has to rely on computers to carry out the number crunching to produce a solution of the complex equations for each particle separately. But the benefit of the kinetic approach is that it can model currents, double layers and parallel electric fields, which are needed to explain plasma behaviour in some situations. However, as Alfvén pointed out in 1977, there are many situations in which the magnetic approach is perfectly adequate. Since the beginning of the century, physics has been dualistic in the sense that some phenomena are described by a field concept, others by a particle concept, Alfvén wrote. This dualism is essential also in the physics of cosmic plasmas. Some phenomena should be described by a magnetic field formalism, others by an electric current formalism. So there's room for both approaches, as long as the limits of applicability of the fluid analysis are recognised, as some plasma physicists, such as Parkes, have been arguing for many years. But you wouldn't know that from listening to the EU. One has to wonder why the EU refused to acknowledge the one group of mainstream scientists they are at least in partial agreement with. Surely they're not trying to reserve the turf exclusively for themselves, so that when the mainstream scientists move in, the non-PU aspects get swept away. That would be a terribly dog-in-the-manger attitude, if that's what's happening. But as we've seen, you're buying into this whole pattern of behaviour when you subscribe to the EU. It's in the EU box, along with the rest of their theories. So we can add these to our diagram on the EU side, along with the missing kinetic approach on the PU side. I think you can probably see where we're going from here. You're not quite getting what you thought you were getting from the special offer. But we also need to look at what else is missing from the PU box. You may have noticed that we've only barely mentioned episode 1 of T10R so far. The title of that episode is Galactic Magnetic Fields, and it presents another of the EU's central claims that currents generate magnetic fields. As we saw above, episode 2 confirmed the view that electric currents are required to produce and sustain the magnetic fields. The EU claim that the fact that magnetic fields are present throughout the cosmos must be direct evidence of currents in space, and hence support for their model. But this is incorrect. I need to spend a little bit of time explaining why it's incorrect, because it goes to the heart of the whole EU approach. In their view, magnetic fields arise exclusively from electric currents, and therefore the magnetic field must be relegated to a supporting role at best. And this is diametrically opposed to the mainstream view. However, while I agree that the consensus view is too skewed towards the role of magnetism at the expense of electric currents, I'm equally convinced that the EU's approach has gone too far the other way by insisting on the primacy of their electric chicken over the magnetic egg. It's undeniable, as the EU like to say, that plasma obeys Maxwell's equations. But Maxwell was well aware that electricity and magnetism are two sides of the same coin. In any non-static situation, a changing electric flux is associated with a non-zero magnetic field. And likewise, a changing magnetic flux is associated with a non-zero electric field. However, the two situations aren't entirely symmetric, because a magnetic field can also be generated by an electric current. And it's apparently this last point that the EU base their claim on. As we saw above, the EU insists that the electric currents arise because of a vast substructure of electric potential, that is, potential differences, between different regions of the cosmos. But where do these PDs come from? The EU is silent on the question. But it seems to me that we have a situation analogous to the question of where does the matter in the universe come from originally. The Big Bang model offers one possible solution, involving a massive free lunch out of nowhere. In contrast, the EU suggests that the universe has always been there. Well, if that's so, why couldn't the cosmic magnetic field always have been there as well? Or, if you prefer a more deterministic model, remember that every electron and every proton has its own magnetic moment. That means it comes complete with a small magnetic field. And if you combine a proton and an electron into a hydrogen atom, it doesn't destroy their fields. And so most particles in the universe, whether plasma or hydrogen, still have magnetic fields of their own. And that's whether or not there was a Big Bang beginning. Now, it's inconceivable to me that you could have any matter particles in the universe without having regions of seed magnetic field from all these particles. The simple random distributions of the particle density or their spin directions and their mutual effects on each other would mean that there would inevitably be some regions with a bit more magnetic field, some with a bit less, some where the average of the magnetic field was pointing one way, some another direction, and so on. I mean, if you think about the effect a bar magnet has on iron filings, it tends to align them all with its own magnetic field. And so each of those little magnetic fields is trying to do the same in all the other magnetic fields in its area. They're going to want to try and align up. So you're going to destroy the randomness. Now, just as an aside, you can't apply similar arguments to justify the EU's presumption of initial weak potential differences throughout the cosmos. And that's because the EU's all-important Coulomb force prevents charge separation on any significant scale. So that's one difference between electricity and magnetism. Going back to magnetism, the principles of magnetic field generation have already been recognised. For example, in a Biermann battery, magnetic fields develop spontaneously. That is, from initially being zero, when there are non-parallel gradients in electron, temperature and density. Well, that's exactly the sort of thing I've been suggesting. You're bound to get the magnetic fields. But were currents involved in this? No. at least not in the form that the EU maintain must be the source of magnetic fields. You could argue that an electron orbiting a proton in a hydrogen atom is a current, and this process is what makes an iron bar into a magnet. But the field was there first, and there's no potential difference driving the electron around the proton in its orbit. Without the magnetic fields of the proton and electron, when they recombined to form a hydrogen atom, the electron would have headed straight into the proton due to the Coulomb force between them. And that's the most important force in the universe according to the EU. But just think about that. Without the magnetic part of the Lorentz force, arising from motion of a charged particle across a magnetic field, the formation of the simplest of all possible atoms would have been impossible. And so it is in plasma, in space. The magnetic field is essential. You can't have an electric current without magnetism, but you can have magnetism without a current. An electron still has its magnetic moment even when it's stationary. And you get more magnetism if you move it relative to a proton and create a current, but there has to be some force to move the electron. That force may be a potential difference, which the EU insists is the only possibility. But the PU box has another method of generating motion. It's called an electromotive force, and it comes about because of Faraday's law of induction, and it works like this. Suppose, for example, that you have a ring of conducting material through the centre of which there is some magnetic flux from a bar magnet nearby. Now change that flux by moving the magnet closer. This immediately results in a change in the amount of curl of the electric field, and this causes an EMF, and so all the electrons in the conducting ring simultaneously start to move around the ring. Now those moving electrons constitute a current around the ring, but notice that there's no potential difference anywhere. There's only an EMF. Now that's induction at work. And of course plasma is a conductor. So you can imagine as many conducting rings as you like in a region of plasma. All the electrons will be affected if the magnetic flux changes, and currents could arise anywhere because of the change of flux. Now EMFs also arise because of the magnetic Lorentz force whenever plasma moves across a background magnetic field. So for example, if you have a region of plasma in interstellar space which is moving across the background galactic field, and an EMF will be generated in the plasma, and Berkeley currents will appear without a potential difference in sight. Is it magic? No, it's just the law of induction at work. Currents are generated from plasma involving nothing more than the magnetic field and relative motion. So the EU's electric chicken is just emerged from a magnetic egg. And this brings us to another point. Magnetic energy can be stored in plasmas. What's more, as Alfvén recognised, but the EU always deny, it can also be frozen in and carried along by plasma in certain situations, depending on the properties of plasma such as temperature, electron density, and the relative strength of the magnetic field permeating it. For example, the solar wind carries magnetic field away from the sun all the time. Another good example of magnetic fields being carried by moving plasma is coronal mass ejections, especially the 10% or so of them which form what are classified as magnetic clouds. Another good example of magnetic fields being carried by moving plasma is coronal mass ejections, especially the 10% or so of them which are classified as magnetic clouds. These are in fact huge plasmoids, that is, self-contained and highly organised plasma structures. The term plasmoid was coined by Bostic to describe these plasma structures, and he also demonstrated that plasma has a natural ability to interchange magnetic and kinetic energy. Whilst electric currents may arise during the process, Bostic's experiments showed that motion across the magnetic field is the primary driver. And likewise, Alfvén showed that currents will arise when a drifting magnetized plasma is able to induce them in a conducting circuit located around the drifting plasma. And so once again we see that the magnetic field often plays a much more important role than the EU allows it to do. It really is a chicken and egg situation in plasma. But you won't find induction or any other role for magnetism inside the EU box, according to the various T10R episodes or their other publicity. Presumably that's because it would undermine their central claim that electric currents from charged planets, stars, and potential differences in the cosmos are the most important aspects of the universe. But whatever the reason for denying the role of magnetism, we're going to have to update our diagram again. But we've now reached the point where there's so much of the PU that's excluded from the EU box that we should really redraw our diagram to show that the EU doesn't include the whole of the PU as we assumed initially. So you really aren't getting everything you thought you were buying with the EU special offer. Our new diagram shows that the EU appears to be an extension of the PU in one particular direction. But is the EU a valid extension of the PU? I don't think so. The EU offers a very specific model which isn't open to development of its central theses in the way that proper science should be. This cannot represent a valid scientific extension of the PU. Moving a large part of the PU outside the EU box has another very important consequence. It means there can be developments of PU theory which are in a different direction to the one promoted by the EU, as for example we saw earlier with the interpretation of the heliospheric current sheet. And that brings us to another feature of the EU. Their dogmatic insistence that their model is the only possible alternative to the mainstream consensus model. We've already seen how the EU misrepresent the mainstream position as an undivided one supporting a single consensus viewpoint, and deny that there are in fact a number of different views within mainstream science. But the problem goes further than that. The EU also dismiss out of hand all alternative models based on the principles which they themselves adhere to. That is, plasma phenomena in space, which could be related to historical and mythological events. A good example is what I and Renz have separately referred to as the gold scenario, in which extreme solar eruptions have potentially catastrophic effects on the Earth because of electromagnetic induction, not because of the EU's hypothesis of a Berkman current between the Sun and the Earth. Now, Peratt referred to Thomas Gould's work in his first paper on petroglyphs and Z-binge. Gould had described how an extreme increase in the solar wind speed would compress the Earth's magnetosphere down to the point where the induced currents in the magnetopores would short out to the surface of the Earth instead of closing through the upper atmosphere. So we can see that here. This is the normal situation. You get currents induced in the outer edge because of the interaction with the solar wind. And the circuit closes through the lower part here, above the insulating atmosphere. Under extreme solar wind conditions, the whole magnetosphere is compressed down to the point where, in fact, that boundary largely disappears. This gets mixed in. And so the currents find it easier to short out through the conducting Earth and back out again here. So at these points, through the surface of the Earth and lower atmosphere, you get enormous electrical discharges, huge lightning strikes in other words. So that's what we call the Gould scenario. The Gould scenario is an extreme example of the well-known, if not completely understood, phenomenon of solar wind magnetosphere coupling. And I examined that in detail in my paper on tectonic uplift. In that paper, I showed that there's more than enough energy in a huge coronal mass ejection to have caused the raising of the Andes, even if only a fraction of that energy was delivered to the surface of the Earth by Gould's mechanism. Unfortunately, in his later petroglyph papers, Peratt moved away from his initial exploration of Gould's work and developed an EU-specific alternative explanation in the form of a massive plasma column of Birkeland current located above the Earth's south pole. The inductive aspects of the SWMC mechanism were completely lost in the process. However, Enz and I showed conclusively in 2013 that Peratt's polar column cannot explain the worldwide evidence of petroglyphs as he had claimed. Apparently, the value of Peratt's early insights had been compromised by his later attempt to force-fit the observations into the EU's model of Birkeland currents and the Saturn configuration. Now, another example of alternative models is the question of whether Venus was ever a comet. Hopefully that will be of more interest to you today. To the EU, this Velikovskian suggestion remains at the very heart of EU theory, along with the claim that Venus still carries a significant proportion of its supposed original potential difference from the time that it was in a very different orbit. In Worlds in Collision, Velikovsky based his claim that Venus had been a comet both on the mythological evidence and also on his interpretation of the anomalous numerical data contained in the ancient Hindu astronomical text, the Panchasavantika. Now, Velikovsky claimed that these ancient records of observations of the synodic periods of the planets showed that both Venus and Mars must have been on very different orbits to those they occupy at present. However, as I showed in a presentation here last year, the anomalous data in the Panchasavantika is consistent for all 5 planets recorded. So that's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. And it implies orbital periods for the 5 planets and Earth itself of only 98.5% of their present-day values. Now, if this data is accurate, this certainly requires an explanation. But whatever the explanation, Velikovsky was incorrect to claim that this data showed that only Venus and Mars must have had orbits very different to their present ones, and to use this as strong support for his theory of near collisions between Mars, Venus and Earth in the recent past. And similarly, both Velikovsky and the EU after him latch on to ancient reports in Augustine's writings of alterations to Venus's orbital motions. They take this as direct evidence that Venus was originally a comet which was captured by the Sun and became a planet with a near circular orbit. However, as Renz has pointed out, Augustine also stated that Venus soon resumed its original orbit, a fact which rules out Venus previously having been a comet. Renz also showed in a number of articles that the mythological data can be interpreted very differently. All the descriptions of Venus having had cometary characteristics, which the EU take to be evidence that Venus was a comet, may instead be seen simply as a description of Venus appearing comet-like, whilst remaining in or close to its usual orbit. For example, Venus could have been seen with a tail similar to a real comet's one. In fact, modern observations have shown that Venus does have a comet-like tail, although it's not visible to the naked eye. As the solar wind sweeps around Venus, it forms an elongated magnetotail, which has been shown to stretch as far as Earth's orbit, and also shows a remarkably comet-like concentration of solar wind on both edges of the planet. As Renz has suggested, it's possible that the solar wind flow past planet Venus increased during a period of extreme solar activity, to the point where its normal magnetotail became visible to ancient peoples. So it's not a logical deduction to conclude that observations of Venus appearing like a comet must have meant that it was a comet on a different orbit. These two examples are just two of many possible ones which I could have chosen to illustrate the point that there are alternative explanations of historical and mythological records in terms of plasma phenomena. And what's more, unlike the EU model, they don't require the misrepresentation or omission of parts of the evidence. But they aren't considered by the EU because they don't conform to their particular preconceived ideas. We can include these different interpretations on our new diagram of the EU and PU boxes to show the different branches from the common principle that myths can illuminate plasma cosmology and vice versa. Now, I think it's a great pity that the EU has become so dogmatic. I mean, it seems to me as though the principles have invested so much time and effort into promoting one particular model that they cannot accept any significant changes to it at this point. And the irony, of course, is that resistance to change is one of the things which the EU regularly criticise the mainstream about. It's yet another example of the pot calling the kettle black. And similarly, the EU often try to claim the moral high ground by suggesting that the mainstream scientists aren't practicing science in the proper manner. And two recent examples will represent many others. The Thunderbolts Project newsletter of 19th of August this year states that failure to see contradictory evidence is not elegant. And their Space News of 13th of August states, openness and critical scientific judgment must be partners. But what's breathtaking is the hypocrisy of these statements. The EU themselves are guilty of failure to see contradictory evidence. They're not open to alternative ideas, and they don't demonstrate critical scientific judgment. And yet they openly imply that these are the principles that should be adhered to. But maybe all that matters is attracting an audience. Talking of which, the EU announced on September the 16th that they are developing a 13-part series with Gaia TV. They're confident that this will draw substantial new audiences to the EU movement in the coming year. So, are Gaia TV interested in the physics, or just the audience numbers? According to Wikipedia, Gaia TV is a subscription and streaming service for videos on yoga, fitness, personal growth, spirituality, and pseudoscience. Shows cover several pseudoscientific topics such as psychic vampires, hollow earth theory, and mummified aliens. This content has been criticised as misleading or falsified. Well, it's a perfect fit with the EU, but it might backfire. How could anyone take their hypotheses seriously after this? So why does all this matter? Surely the EU deserve credit, not criticism, for advancing astrophysics by bringing the electrical behaviour of plasma in space to everyone's attention. Well, no, I disagree. The problem is, as we've seen, the EU are not practicing the scientific method. Instead, they're promoting their own particular theories for their own ends. In doing so, and by constantly denigrating all astrophysicists and cosmologists, they're making it nearly impossible for anyone in the mainstream to incorporate kinetic modelling of currents, double layers and the like into astrophysics because of fear of ridicule on the grounds that they're siding with pseudoscientists. So instead of furthering the science of astrophysics in a new enlightenment, as Adrian suggested, the EU are actually holding back progress in the one area in which they say they would like to see progress being made. The long-term effect of the EU's constant publicity, remember all those episodes Dave told us quoted? The long-term effect is not going to be to demonstrate that they are the inheritors of the plasma mantle of Birkeland, Alfvén and Peratt, as they like to claim, but instead to tar the legacy of those founders of PU theory with the EU brush. The EU are also stifling development of alternative, catastrophic models of plasma behaviour, linking myth to plasma cosmology. Now, researchers, including Galactic, Parat, and even the EU themselves, deserve credit for exploring the link between myths and electrical or plasma events in space. But the EU are wrong to claim that their model is the only possible explanation. The principle of myths illuminating plasma cosmology and vice versa is one which is shared between the EU and the PU, but the developments from that principle lead in very different directions. There are viable alternatives based on known plasma behaviour rather than on colliding charged planets, hand-waving speculations about what plasma might be capable of, and misinterpretations of the actual evidence. And I suggest that these alternatives are much more likely to lead to a real breakthrough in understanding, both of how the universe really works and of how plasma events might have been experienced by humankind within the last 12,000 years. Not 2,000 or 3,000 years, 12,000 years. So the EU approach is beginning to look very much like a dead end, which leads nowhere, because it's strictly limited by their dogmatic insistence on one particular model. But the good news is that when it's recognised that PU theory is not constrained by being contained entirely within the EU box, then plasma cosmology can continue to develop independent of the EU sidetrack. So I suggest it does matter that we keep in mind the differences between the EU and the PU, and that we remember there are alternative explanations for all the genuine evidence of plasma behaviour, which the EU erroneously claim proves that their model must be correct. Thank you for listening.